In this video, I'm going to show you how to do the long tail cast on. Now, most videos recommend you start with a slip knot for the long tail cast on, but I'm going to tell you you can start with a slip knot or not. If you want to not have a slip knot in the beginning of your work, you will lay your yarn over the needle so that the tail is closest to you. So I have the tail here. You'll just lay it over the needle like that, and then insert your thumb and pointer finger between the two strands and grab the two strands with the rest of your fingers, spreading your thumb and pointer finger out and pulling the needle back kind of like a slingshot. Now I'm going to show you how to start the setup with a slip knot. So you'll tie a slip knot in your yarn, giving yourself a nice long tail, because this is called the long tail cast on. And then you'll insert the needle into the slip knot and snug the knot up to your needle. Again, you want to make sure you have your tail closest to you. Insert your thumb and pointer finger between those two yarns, then grab the yarns with your other fingers. Spread your finger and thumb apart, pull the needle back so it's kind of like a slingshot. Now we're ready to start the cast on. I'm going to tilt my hands this way so you can see what I'm doing. To start the cast on, you will go under the outside thumb yarn, then over the yarn coming off of your finger, and drag that back through the loop around your thumb. Now drop your thumb out and put it back in underneath the yarn as you're pulling the stitch tight. I'll show you again. Bring the needle under the outside thumb yarn, over the yarn on your finger, drag that yarn back through the thumb loop, drop your thumb out while you're pulling the stitch tight, insert your thumb as you continue to pull the stitch tight, and you're ready to start again. Under the outside loop on your thumb, over your finger thumb, over your finger yarn, drag that yarn back through the thumb loop, drop your thumb out, put your thumb back in the tail yarn, and pull it tight. I'm going to keep doing this while I tell you some things about the cast on. So when you're doing the long tail cast on, ensure that when you're forming your stitches that you are not doing them up here on the tip, because your stitches will end up too small if you're tightening them around the tip there. You want them to be down on the shaft, and you snug them up. You don't want them to be overly tight. If it's hard to knit into your cast on, it means you're doing it too tightly. So keep it down on the shaft and snug the stitches up, but don't, do the death grip on them and pull them super tight. If you happen to have loose loops of yarn on your needle, you're doing something wrong, because as you can see here, each stitch is secured. That stitch isn't going to fall off. It'll come a little loose when I let go, but it's not just a loopy piece of yarn like this, around your needle. Okay. Now, it's interesting, the long tail cast on actually produces the cast on and the first row of knit stitches. And you can learn more about that in the tutorial that I wrote to go along with this video. But you can sometimes omit or skip the first row of stitches in your pattern when you use the long tail cast on. So that's kind of an interesting property about this cast on. One of the things that happens oftentimes is, you can see what's happening here. This yarn has become unplied. See how it's all untwisted? So that's why, one of the reasons why it's important to have the tail yarn over your thumb, because that yarn over your thumb often becomes untwisted, and it's easier to twist it back up if it's the tail than to try to twist it back up if it's the yarn attached to the ball. So just know that that happens, and you can twist it back up easily if you've done it with the tail over your thumb. If you mistakenly do the tail over your finger rather than your thumb, it's not going to make a visible difference in your cast on, but you could run out of tail. if you do that, because the yarn that's coming from the ball is the yarn that's going over the needle here, and the tail yarn is the one that's running just underneath the stitches here. So the tail yarn uses less yarn, or I'm sorry, the yarn going over your thumb uses less yarn than the yarn coming from the ball. There's lots of advice on the internet about how to estimate the length of the tail for the long tail cast on, and honestly, some of it's just wrong. Probably one of the most common ways people teach you to estimate your tail length is to take your yarn and wrap it around the needle 10 times and then see how much yarn that requires, saying that that estimates 10 stitches, and then use that to determine how many inches you need to cast on. But there's a problem with that, because the ball yarn is the yarn that goes around the needle. The tail yarn is what's forming this cast on edge here. And while we're looking at this, I want to show you what the cast on looks like up close. So this is the front side of the cast on, the side that we just completed. And if we turn it around and look at the back side, you can see that there are a whole bunch of purl bumps, because the long tail cast on actually combines the cast on with the first row of knitting, and that is explained more in the tutorial that I wrote to go along with this video. So you'll have little purl bumps on the back side, and the front side will look like this. So the way I like to estimate the tail is to do the slip knot and then cast on 10 stitches. So I have 11 stitches on here total, the slip knot plus 10 stitches. And then grasp the tail right at the end of that 10th stitch and slide them off your needle. And carefully unravel them so that you don't pull out the slip knot. Now measure from your finger where you're pinching the yarn at the end of your 10 stitches to the slip knot. See, I've got my slip knot right there. It's just over 5 inches. So let's say it's 5.5 inches for 10 stitches. So now you know that for every 10 stitches in your cast on, you need 5.5 inches of yarn. So if you, for example, if you have 20 stitches in your cast on, you'll need 11 inches to do the cast on. Now you also need a tail when you're done your cast on, so you have something to sew in at the end of your work. So you'll want to add about 6 inches to whatever measurement you get so that you have a tail. And if you're casting on a whole bunch of stitches, you might want to add just a little bit more for good measure, because it would be a whole lot less frustrating to waste a foot or two of yarn than to have to rip out and redo, you know, like a 200 stitch cast on. So with that, I encourage you to go try the long tail cast on and read the full tutorial if you have not. There's a link, if you're watching this video on YouTube, right below the video to go to the full tutorial.